Well, hello there, watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the political commentator and former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. Welcome to both of you, with us from now until just before midnight. To the front pages then, let's start with the Eye, which says the government is bracing for a winter of discontent as transport staff, NHS workers, teachers and members of unions and a number of other sectors all plan to go on strike. The Express criticises possible government plans to delay the introduction of a cost cap for social care funding. The Financial Times reports that inflation in the US has fallen at a faster rate than expected. The Telegraph leads with a call from the US to Ukraine to use the G20 to find a route to peace in its war with Russia. The Times has an interview with the former Chancellor Kwarteng, where he says he tried to warn Liz Truss that her radical economic reforms would not work. The Daily Mail looks at the latest motorway chaos caused by Just Stop Oil protesters and asks, what is the point of these police? While The Guardian has an exclusive with news that 100,000 children are missing out on free school meals after the eligibility criteria was frozen. According to the Metro, the comedian and Britain's Got Talent judge David Walliams has been forced to apologise after archival off-air footage emerged, showing him making derogatory sexual remarks about contestants. And The Star has the story of a woman who had an unfortunate run-in with a seagull. A psycho one. Anyway, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen through the programme, you can check out the front pages. But in the meantime, let's go to our guest straight away. And I'm afraid we don't start with cheer. Kicking off, Salma with the Eye. Reading that first paragraph, goodness me, 100,000 civil servants vote to join nurses, train drivers, postal workers, bus drivers, London Underground staff, bin men, midwives, baggage handlers, university lecturers in a walking out, with teachers, firefighters and 300,000 NHS workers all balloting for strikes. Goodness me, what a list of to-do for this government and those employers.
Yes, absolutely. And also, this is going to be a unique stress, I think, that's placed on the government, because the reason that these workers have been balloted is overpay, which, of course, is advised on by independent pay bodies. But it is the government and ministers that essentially have to decide on how that pay is going to go forward. And there is going to be extreme resistance, as we all know, because the fiscal picture in government is incredibly bad, which means that it's unlikely that these workers are going to be given the pay rises that they seek. I think the issue here as well is that people have really gotten to the end of their tether on issues like pay. We've gone through several cycles of sort of wage freezes in the public sector. And whilst I have a lot of sympathy for the government's position in that there is very little room to manoeuvre, I think it is quite obvious where the frustration is coming from, with a lot of people who've faced stagnating wages for a very long time in a period where the cost of living is becoming, incredibly unmanageable.
Yes, the fiscal position is indeed difficult. We will find out more about that next week, obviously next week today. But in terms of what happens next and the unions, the Eye suggesting they'll meet on Monday to try to coordinate their members' strike action, which could see rail workers walk out at the same time as National Highways teams. Possibly more, Steve? What's the picture look like from your perspective?
Very bleak. I mean, for a book I'm doing, I've been looking at the Winter of Discontent recently in 1979, which is that famous kind of iconic period, where actually quite a lot of the images from the Winter of Discontent of 79 were based on unofficial strikes in just one part of the country. The dead unburied, the rubbish on the streets. It was not actually as universal or as bad as mythology suggests. If all of these official strikes, balloted strikes, go ahead, it will be much, much worse than the Winter of Discontent in 79. Now, who knows whether they all will, but as you suggest, some of them are being coordinated for maximum disruption. And it's not at all clear what the way through is here, because as Salma suggested, the government is, if anything, determined to do even less in terms of public spending than they were just 4 weeks ago. So, and yet there is this cost of living crisis and this intense frustration, and these are balloted strikes. and it's a collision course with no obvious solution at the moment.
Yes, and just on the the autumn spending statement we're expecting next week, some people, the narrative's starting to be, this figure of 55 billion is arbitrary. It's sort of chosen to pay back now. And I see in the Financial Times that the Chancellor, they're reporting, is looking at filling about half of the 55 billion fiscal hole by freezing public spending in real terms for 3 years after 2025. So it does feel like kicking that can down the road, possibly. But in the meantime, if we go, Salma, to the Times, that demand for pay and for funding, quite clear, with the worst ever NHS waiting times, which the paper says is now costing lives.
Yes, so we've obviously had this month the worst waiting times on record. And this is something that the government has spent a lot of time trying to say that they are looking to resolve. And a lot of this obviously is legacy from the pandemic. But the strikes and what's going to happen to the public sector spending is going to compound a lot of this. And in some of the reporting, it's not clear, I can't see whether it's actually in the Times, but in a lot of the reporting around this, there's obviously the question about whether actually the NHS is going to have some form of protection around it in terms of the spending cuts. But even with that, with real terms prices rising, it's going to be a really painful exercise throughout the winter and obviously into the new year to be able to see how those waiting lists are going to come down and how GP surgeries and operation and waiting lists more generally are going to improve their services. And I think people are really starting to feel the frustration across the piece, and the strikes are just going to compound this.
And meantime, the Daily Express, Steve, knowing its audience, I guess, with this story, the architect of the government's social care cap has launched a scathing attack on moves to delay its implementation. The idea that you only spend so much of a proportion, for example, of your own home ownership on your social care costs, which got thrown up after the dementia tax issues of Theresa May.
This is a complete shambles. If you remember when Boris Johnson stood on the steps of Number 10 for the first time in July 2019, he said he had a plan for social care. I'm not at all sure he did. But in the end, they put up national insurance to pay for a social care levy. Even then, it wasn't going to social care for a time. It was going to go to the NHS. Now they've scrapped the national insurance rise, and that's still in place. That's the one thing from the Truss era that remains in place. So it's not at all clear where the money is going to come from, was going to come from. But I think the Express is campaigning not only perhaps with its own demographic in mind and the fact that Boris Johnson, one of its heroes, authored this in the first place, but because it is an absolute betrayal. It was in their manifesto in 2019 that they were going to do this. And as I say, it was the one thing that Boris Johnson highlighted apart from Brexit when he got in. Now, he's not there now. There have been many prime ministers since. But it has been a theme, I'd say, based on the manifesto as well. And it looks as if, yet again, the will to address this issue is just going to crumble.
Yeah.
And it's going to be dropped.
Yeah, a little bit like pension age rises, which got booted out for years until Tony Blair tackled it, certainly. But just very quickly, Salma, reflecting on what I read out from the Financial Times, this idea that half of the 55 billion fiscal hole will be dealt with effectively after the next election. Would that be a good solution to this? Would it keep the markets calm enough, do you think?
I think that probably one of the reasons that they are doing that, which is essentially changing the profile of when they're paying debt back, is that they can't do it within this electoral cycle because there isn't enough time left. And changing the profile of being able to sort of spend it over a longer term period also means that you're spreading the pain out across a long period of time. The reality is, though, whether the markets respond to that or not is what the market judgment is going to be as to what happens at the next election, because there are lots of points at which this plan can be upended. Another budget could change what the plans are for this one. An election and perhaps a new government could also change what the plan is going to be on this fiscal picture. So you might set that out and it might calm the markets for a certain point, but there is always ways that can actually be altered coming down the track.
Let's just move on, Steve, to Ukraine, if we can. Front page of the Daily Telegraph. This big G20 meeting coming up. The suggestion is that Vladimir Putin could arrive via video link. And the US reportedly telling Ukraine there is a window of opportunity to start talking, to discuss an endgame in this. But, you know, that's a very sensitive issue, isn't it? Allies telling Ukraine what to do is a sore subject.
It is, but I hope these reports, which made the splash in the Telegraph, are true, that there is going to be some attempt at some level of engagement with who knows what outcome if it were to take place. But I mean, the alternative is so bleak of just these continuing nightmarish image, which I know you've been featuring again today on the news bulletins and so on. That at some point there has to be some kind of diplomatic initiative. Now, I know the British government position and many other governments' position is Ukraine must be seen to win, without quite specifying what that means precisely. So I do think it's vaguely, tentatively encouraging that the US is trying to get some kind of talks going. Who knows where they will go? Maybe they'll go nowhere. But it's,
yes.
I think, an important.
OK, full coverage of that G20 summit, certainly. Stay there, both of you. Lots more still to come, including the former Chancellor, Kwarteng, giving an interview saying he warned Liz Truss her policies were heading too far and too fast. Back with that in just a moment. Watching the press preview with me now, Steve Richards and Salma Shah. Welcome back to both of you. And Salma, we go straight to the Times. An interview with Kwarteng, absolutely fascinating, about what he thought about Liz Truss was doing and what he thought about that mini budget. What do we learn?
Well, this is an absolutely astonishing interview because, of course, this is probably the first time that Kwarteng, the former Chancellor, has spoken in any detail about what happened with that mini budget. And I think the headline takeaway from this, and a lot of the quotes that are used, early on in the piece, are all about how he was telling the Prime Minister that perhaps she should slow down with her breakneck speed that she was taking in order to create growth in the economy. And one of the quotes that I find absolutely astonishing in this piece is that he says that he does believe that he bears some of the responsibility of the mini budget, which of course he does, because he's the Chancellor that delivered it. And I think it's very interesting from my perspective, certainly reading this, is that he's slightly distancing himself from, what is very clearly a train wreck of a political intervention, and sort of pushing it all on Liz and saying that actually I didn't think it was a great idea for her to sack me because the Prime Minister was going to be next. And there is a lot of sort of redefining and perhaps putting a little bit of his own historical gloss over events now. Now that he's given this interview, I think perhaps to save his reputation a little.
Yes, and found out that he had been sacked after seeing a tweet from the Times' political editor. But after the mini budget, he says, Steve, we were going at breakneck speed. And I said, we should slow down. She said, well, I've only got 2 years. And I said, you'll have 2 months if you carry on like this. He said he had reservations about the scale of the planned tax cuts in his mini budget, especially as there were no accompanying plans to reduce government spending. I mean, this is, it just basically puts almost all the blame on Liz Truss, does it not?
It does, and who knows? I mean, for sure, she was clearly driving this. You could tell that from the tone of her leadership campaign and what she said from the moment she arrived in Number 10. But he was her accomplice, so to speak. And the other thing which is omitted from this explanation is he went on all the Sunday interview programs, or at least one after his mini budget, said, you just wait, there are more tax cuts to come. Now, maybe he was carrying out instructions from Liz Truss, but he seemed a pretty enthusiastic evangelist for this failed revolution at the time. But this is what often happens, actually, with chancellors. I mean, he went through the trauma of being sacked at such humiliating speed, but when John Major sacked Norman Lamont, he came and put his case very quickly. They want to put what they consider to be a version which will partially rehabilitate them. It's come very quickly, but this whole period has been speeded up politics.
Yeah, a fascinating read, and the bits we all want to know, obviously, as well. Salma Shah, Steve Richards, thank you both. Thank you.